Hello friends, welcome back to Cloud Pedagogy. In this lesson, we are going to talk about CodeCommit configuration options, and this gets into your operating system. It may be Linux, Windows, Mac OS, and then it also gets into how we want to communicate with CodeCommit. And our options are HTTPS and SSH. Since our student directory application is running on Linux Mission 2023, we are going to walk through on the same and also its advantages in that case to use HTTPS. But in this lesson, we will find out why that's advantageous. We will dig into the details and also we'll look at HTTPS and SSH. We'll also understand the use cases for each. We need to understand the communication protocols available to work with CodeCommit. Means HTTPS and SSH, and also understand the pros and cons of each and which protocol is right for our selected operating system. Next, we are going to focus on our IAM configuration, which we will need to work with CodeCommit. In fact, all API calls in AWS must be both signed and authenticated in order to be allowed, no matter if the resource lives in the same account or not. So, to use AWS CodeCommit, we have to attach some policies to user, and we have to generate access keys and CodeCommit credentials, because there are a lot of bad people out there looking to do bad things to our applications. So we just have to deal with some security concerns up front, and we want to protect our repositories. And to do that in AWS, we need to set some things up in IAM, and just as I mentioned. So let's start with talking about HTTPS and SSH. First thing that we need to understand is that functionally protocols are the same. In the other words, the commands we issue are going to be the same with the exception of course, some of our commands will be prefaced with the protocol HTTPS or SSH. So as an example, if we are working from the command line and we wanted to clone our repository, we would just issue a clone command. So that clone command will just point to our repository. And again, depending on the protocol we use, this will be the only difference, the identification of the protocol. After creating a repo in CodeCommit, then we are given connection steps, either HTTPS or SSH. Some prerequisites like you must use Git client, and you must have an AWS CodeCommit managed policy attached to your IAM user. And we'll certainly do that in upcoming lessons. After that, you can clone the repository. Notice that we just talked about git clone and we are on HTTPS, so that's the command it's going to give us. If we decide to use SSH, well, it's breaking this information down by operating system. With SSH, we have to register a public key. But how do we choose? What are the benefits of HTTPS or SSH based on our operating system? Let's check that out. So the key difference between SSH and HTTPS for use with CodeCommit is to storing and verifying of credentials. So with HTTPS, what you do is allow Git to us a cryptographically signed version of your IAM user credentials. And to do that, you configure a credential helper for Git on your local machine. So just understand what's going on here, but we will get into how of this in upcoming lessons. And it's just important to know that this credential helper will be available to us in the AWS CLI. So when we get into the CLI, the commands for this will be available to us. Now with SSH, we create RSA public and private key files on our local machine. So it's just SSH authentication, and no surprise, HTTPS is on port 443 and SSH is on port 22. So for SSH, we associate the public key with our IAM user and we store the private key on our local machine. Now SSH requires manual configuration of public and private key files. So you might find HTTPS is simpler and easier to use with CodeCommit, and the good news is again, we are using Amazon Linux, and ultimately the best decisions for that configuration is HTTPS, and we'll find out why here momentarily. So what are pros and cons for both of the protocols? Well, let's start with HTTPS. For pros, simple credential management. We are just using HTTPS, and what comes with that is some of the features of HTTPS. We can just use a regular username and password login for HTTPS protocol. Obviously, that makes very simpler. Now with HTTPS, another pro is all data transfers are encrypted by default and port 443 is often open on firewalls in corporate settings. Now a con for HTTPS on macOS is you can run into keychain issues on macOS. That makes it a bit difficult. So unless you enjoy working with the Mac keychain, on a Mac SSH might be your better option. When you come to SSH pros, SSH is very efficient. It compacts the data before sending it, and then just like HTTPS, all data transfers are encrypted. So that's another pro for SSH. What about the cons? Well, again, the difficult part is the credential management, where you create public and private keys. If you're not on a Mac, would be a good enough reason to choose HTTPS, where we can just set up a login for it. And also in corporate settings, firewalls sometimes block port 22. So what do we choose? Well, based on our pros and cons, for Windows and Linux, HTTPS is probably the better choice. Just a little bit easier, not dealing with our public and private keys. Mac OS, that is a different story, because then when we are getting into the keychain issues. So with Mac OS, SSH is probably our better option. Again, our case is website hosted in Amazon Linux. So we are going to go with HTTPS for our walkthroughs. Next, we'll understand why we need IAM configurations. Now, as we learned how CodeCommit can work with Linux, Windows and Mac OS operating systems, and there is a slightly different IAM configuration for each of those. We have made the decision that we are going to use the Linux route. We are going to attach a CodeCommit policy to our student directory application development team. It's going to assign the proper permissions to work with CodeCommit. We are also going to create and retrieve access keys for the CodeCommit users. And you will see it's going to be very straightforward in the labs. Next thing is we are just going to go ahead and configure the credential helper, which is very important in our configuration. So what we need to do to configure the credential helper is go into the command line, and we are going to run a series of git commands which will configure our .git config file. So to recap, when setting our credential helper, it's just important to have done our prerequisites. Set up an IAM user with CodeCommit privileges, install Git and the AWS CLI. And that's it. Next, we'll see configuring SSH for individual users. So when we SSH into our EC2 instance, we are going to SSH in as some of our users. And to do that, what we need to do is add those users to our EC2 instance. So we SSH into the EC2 instance as the general user, that is EC2 user. And then we can configure other users, for example, our student directory application team users like Resh, Kins and Rohis. So you can configure them inside the EC2 instance and set them up so they can SSH into our server. And with that, I'm going to end this session. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the next session. Until then, have fun with learning.